In the past couple years, something significant has been happening in British politics and society. Hard-right parties are emerging, and figures once considered fringe are now moving closer to the mainstream, and in some cases, reshaping it entirely. At the centre of this shift is Reform UK, a party that went from political outsider to a serious electoral force, winning around 14% of the vote in 2024, and going on to dominate local elections and even top national polling in some projections. Across the country, mass rallies led by figures like Tommy Robinson and Britain First are drawing thousands, while new breakaway movements like Rupert Lowe's hardline party Restore Britain are exploding in popularity, gathering mass support, including by the world's richest man, Elon Musk. We've witnessed anti-immigration riots nearly send the nation into civil unrest. The two parties that once held the share of power in the UK have been rejected for people wanting something more radical. Immigration is the #1 voter concern at the moment. The question that needs to be asked is, why is this happening? So, is this simply racism being unleashed? A wave of racial resentment that was always there, now finally finding a political voice? It's a tempting explanation, and for some individuals and groups, there's no doubt that pure prejudice plays a role. But the data suggests that this isn't the full picture. For one, attitudes toward race and diversity in Britain have, overall, become more tolerant over time. Surveys consistently show younger generations are significantly more socially liberal than those before them, and outright racist views remain a minority position. If this were purely about racial hatred, we'd expect to see a broad reversal in those long-term trends, but we don't. Another point would be how anti-racist movements, such as Black Lives Matter in 2020, garnered mass support among the British public, including many people who now vote hard right. So to say they always hated ethnic minorities, or that they do all of a sudden, or that they even do at all, lacks substantiation. There's also the question of who is actually supporting these movements. Many voters backing right-wing populist parties aren't motivated primarily by race, but by concerns over economic security, public services, and political trust. Issues like housing shortages, NHS waiting times, and wage stagnation are often cited alongside immigration, not separate from it. And when people talk about immigration, their concerns are often framed less around ethnicity and more around scale, control, economics, integration, crime, and fairness. Whether the system feels managed, and whether the government is being honest about it. In other words, while racism exists and shouldn't be dismissed, reducing this entire shift to racial hatred alone risks oversimplifying a much more complex reality. Which raises a deeper question. If it's not just racism, what else is driving it? Well, a big part of it is working class voters feeling betrayed by the government and establishment. Because for many voters, this isn't just about politics anymore. It's about a growing sense that the government, of all stripes, has either failed them, ignored them, maybe even was working against them, or simply said one thing and done another. Take immigration. For years, politicians, especially the Conservatives, promised control. Brexit was sold, in part, as the solution. And yet, after leaving the EU, net migration didn't fall. It surged to record highs. For many, that didn't just feel like failure, it felt like a broken promise. Then there's the issue of small boat crossings. Images of thousands arriving across the channel, combined with a system that appears overwhelmed, have reinforced the idea that the state is no longer in control of its own borders. And in more sensitive and controversial areas, like the handling of grooming gang scandals, there's a perception among some communities that authorities were too slow to act, or unwilling to confront difficult truths, in fears of being called racist. Layer on top of that a worsening economic reality, stagnant wages, rising living costs, housing that feels increasingly out of reach, and public services under strain. For many people, life simply feels harder than it did a decade ago. And evidence suggests that partly why many people are becoming more anti-immigration is that the British public view immigrants as voting for parties that are contributing to the destruction, and this could explain why extremely far-right figures will say things like they want Britain to be around 5% non-white, as that typically corresponds to the amount of non-whites voting for parties they support. And this is where parties like Reform UK and Restore Britain step in. They position themselves not just as another political option, but as a direct challenge to the entire system, anti-establishment, anti-elite, and willing to say what others won't. They offer a simple, powerful explanation that many of these problems, pressure on housing, public services, wages, are being driven by immigration. And more importantly, they promise they can fix it. It's a message that cuts through because it connects frustration to a sole cause and offers a simple solution. Certainly, historically establishment-led parties will need to regain a lot of trust if this rise is to be stopped. Another key part of this story is something far more personal: how people feel about their own lives. Because in many parts of Britain, especially outside of London and the South East, there's a growing sense of decline. Town centres are more run down than they used to be. Stable, well-paid jobs have disappeared. Crime and antisocial behaviour feel more visible, and for many, the basic promise that each generation will do better than the last no longer feels true. Real wages, when adjusted for inflation, have barely grown since the late 2000s. Public services are under pressure. Housing is more expensive and harder to access than it's been in decades. So when people look around and feel like things are getting worse, they start asking, why? Into that frustration comes a very powerful narrative, painted by hard right-wing figures. Images of asylum seekers being housed in hotels, often at significant public cost, have become a flashpoint. For people struggling to pay rent or heat their homes, the idea that others are being supported by the state can feel deeply unfair, especially when it's framed as happening for free. They argue that these problems didn't exist, at least not to this extent, before large-scale immigration. That pressure on housing, schools and healthcare is being driven by population growth. That wages are being undercut. That communities are changing too quickly. And ultimately, that immigration is the root cause of decline. Now there is some truth to what they are saying. Rapid mass migration has led to strains on public services due to a population explosion, and crime has seen an increase. But obviously, to put all of those issues down to immigration is not backed by evidence. Because while immigration can increase demand on housing and public services, especially when it's high and poorly managed, and while some of the crime has been committed by new migrants, though not exclusively, it's only one part of a much bigger picture. Years of underinvestment, austerity policies, regional inequality, and economic change have all played major roles in shaping these conditions. In other words, mass rapid immigration can contribute to pressure, but it doesn't fully explain why so many places feel left behind. The problem is, simple explanations are often the most persuasive, and when people are struggling, being offered a clear cause and someone to blame can be incredibly compelling. Another part to it is instability. For example, white people in the UK not feeling like they have a stable income, feeling that their town or village or neighbourhood is on edge, and most importantly, not feeling demographic or cultural security, as an example. Many white people tend to have a lower birth rate than other communities, and have seen transformations in areas they grew up in, and they see this as a threat to their existence, and in some cases their safety. They think that the only way to solve this is by removing immigrants or stopping the inflow, and in turn it leads to resentment. African Catholic Cardinal Peter Turkson explained how increasing the European birth rate and integration is an important step to reducing xenophobic hate.
The low fertility rate, the low birth rate, and the low type of thing, and their concern was really that when the local population drops beyond a certain level, it will mean that any newcomer into that society will not be well received. So it was actually to ensure that the birth rate in Europe does not lead to a certain amount of xenophobic.
Another major factor in this story isn't just what people are thinking, but what they're seeing. Because over the past few years, the media environment in Britain has changed dramatically. And two platforms in particular have played a significant role: Elon Musk's X and the rise of GB News. Starting with X, formerly Twitter. Since Elon Musk took over the platform in 2022, it's undergone a fundamental shift. Content moderation was loosened, previously banned accounts were reinstated, and the algorithm itself began prioritizing more provocative, engagement-driven content. Investigations have found that right-wing and more extreme political content is now more likely to be promoted to users, even those who aren't actively seeking it out. At the same time, Musk hasn't just been a passive owner. He's actively engaged in British politics. He's interacted with and amplified figures like Rupert Lowe, dramatically increasing their reach, and has even expressed support for controversial figures like Tommy Robinson. During major events, like the 2024 riots and subsequent protests, posts on X spreading misinformation or inflammatory narratives reached hundreds of millions of views.
So an undocumented migrant decided to go into a Taylor Swift dance class today and stab 6 little girls. That's right, somebody arrived in the UK on a boat.
In some cases, authorities later concluded that this kind of online content helped fuel unrest on the ground. In simple terms, ideas that once existed on the fringes are now being pushed directly into people's feeds, at scale. And then there's GB News. Launched as an alternative to what it calls the mainstream media, which has lost its trust among the public. GB News has carved out a space for more openly opinionated, anti-establishment broadcasting. It regularly features politicians and commentators from the populist right, blurring the line between media and politics. In fact, millions of pounds have been poured into a wider ecosystem of right-leaning media in Britain, including GB News, helping amplify these voices and push them further into the mainstream. The result is a feedback loop. People who already feel frustrated or ignored are now exposed, more than ever, to content that reinforces those feelings. Stories about immigration, crime, and government failure are repeated, intensified, and often simplified into clear narratives about who is to blame. And when those narratives are everywhere, on your phone, on your TV, in political speeches, it's no longer fringe. It becomes part of the national conversation. Which leads to the bigger question: how much of this rise is being driven by genuine public feeling, and how much is being shaped by the information people are seeing every day? However, this dramatic shift to the far right in British politics, although cumulated by many events, can be directly linked to a single incident. Southport. In Britain, Southport saw one of our history's most significant murders. Disgraced Axel Rudabakana killed 3 young girls at a dance club. Shocking in itself, the government's and media's response added flames. They delayed revealing his identity and called him a quiet choir boy. It later emerged he'd been referred multiple times for extremism prevention, carried a knife in school, yet authorities failed to act. It didn't happen in isolation. The tragedy hit a tense, divided nation, questioning those in power. Immediately, it became a lightning rod. On X especially, questions on identity, immigration, and policing surged, confirming deep fears. Southport unlocked years of frustration over immigration, crime, and institutional trust, providing a tangible, emotional focal point impossible to ignore. Protests erupted, debates raged, positions hardened. Many saw it as proof the system failed to protect them, with mainstream politics unwilling to address issues honestly. Hard-right groups seized the moment, framing the killings as evidence of immigration and government failures. They channeled public anger, shifting the Overton window sharply their way. Moments like this accelerate change. Southport didn't create tensions, but surfaced them dramatically. A turning point after which politics never returns to normal. If far-right rise stems from frustration, distrust, economic woes, instability, fear, and evolving media, how do we stop it? Step 1. Rebuild trust. Voters believe the system no longer works for them. Governments must deliver, especially clear, controlled immigration policies with visible results, valuing integration and law obedience. Fixing the broken system counters extreme anti-migrant rhetoric. Step 2. Economic reality. Invest in jobs, infrastructure, housing and services in left-behind areas to end feelings of abandonment. Step 3. Honesty. Stop avoiding talks on immigration, integration or crime. Evidence-based openness removes the vacuum extremists fill. Step 4. Better information. Boost media literacy and challenge misinformation to prevent anger manipulation. Most crucially, offer an alternative. Labeling concerns as racism fails. Instead, provide a working system, trusted leaders, and a stable, fair future. Then simple blame loses appeal. Thank you for watching. If you want to help the channel so I can continue making these videos, please like, share, and subscribe.